Hi, it's Saturday, February 4th, and I'm going to say just a few more things about symbolic interaction in conclusion, and then about chapter 1 and also the quiz very briefly. So, we spoke about symbolic interaction as looking at the interactional situation as the source of the determination of how a situation unfolds, so that there isn't a kind of predetermined, let's say, script, as you will, but that things unfold within the interactional context, that the world is dynamic, that anything is really possible and we can't predict. So another important facet of symbolic interaction that I want to mention is the concept or notion of agency. And what's unique about the symbolic interaction approach is that it posits that there is an individual that is a self-determining agent who is capable of deciding the direction of his or her life through, again, this interactional situation. And it's unique because if we look at maybe a psychological approach to understanding the individual, or for example, a sociological approach. And Herbert Blumer, who is a sociologist and symbolic interactionist, gives a very good critique of both psychological and sociological approaches to understanding human beings as being equally deficient and wrong. And now I'm overgeneralizing just to make the point, because there are, speaking now about psychology, there are many psychological approaches, developmental approach to understanding human beings, psychoanalytic, behavioral. So there are many different approaches, and they're all complex. But just to make a point now, and certainly Bloomer makes a similar point, so I'm referring to what he said about it. But when we look at a psychological view of the individual, it's limiting in the sense that we're looking at the individual as predetermined by certain, in this case, psychological factors, personality, disposition, so that behavior that's carried out by the individual is a result of these psychological determinants. For example, somebody's introverted, or somebody has a certain type of personality and therefore has inherited certain kinds of capacities or abilities, and therefore the person is determined by those factors versus looked upon as a free agent, right, who's making conscious, determined, independent decisions. And equally, on the sociological side, now looking from a macro versus a maybe more individual vantage point, you have a situation where behavior and social kinds of reality are determined by social structural issues. So that, for example, each of us lives in a certain kind of society. And our behavior is seen as a kind of response to the structural determinants of our social condition. Or put another way, for example, think about how we each come from a certain culture and a certain family background. And within that family, those kind of cultural traditions are passed down to us, so that we learn certain kinds of attitudes and certain kinds of behavioral patterns and norms, acceptable norms and values. And we behave and we react towards situations based on those kinds of norms that we've internalized. So that's this general, again, simplifying a lot, but that's maybe the general sociological viewpoint. And so again, each of these viewpoints factors out the individual as a self-determining agent. And so what happens is we lose the person, or we lose the unique individuality of a person. And indeed, like, you can think about this right now. You're in college, you might be somebody who's very shy, who's more introverted. So now we're looking at some of the psychological kinds of factors that you might attribute to yourself. But in fact, you may in 5 years from now be a very, very different person. Maybe you'll be doing large kinds of seminars, motivational speaking, training. Who knows? You may be doing something that you could never have dreamed of doing at this point. And the reason is that we have this capacity to transform ourselves. So, what we can do is we can take some small steps, and then we can, from those small steps, they lead to other steps. And then eventually we find that, things that we would have thought were too challenging or impossible do become possible, right? So that's something that can happen. Let's say, for example, you're interested in accounting and you become involved in the VITA program, which is a tax preparation program that helps low income people file their taxes. And let's say, you have basic skills in accounting and some mathematical ability, but you never really thought of yourself as special or very talented. And then let's say you work with these people and they look up to you and they're grateful for the fact that you were able to help them prepare their taxes, and they really see you as a kind of authority or somebody, worthy of a lot of respect. And now you start, based on those interactions, you start really gaining confidence and you start really seeing that you have something important, that you have developed a certain kind of knowledge and capacity and ability that's impressive. And maybe that because of that, you apply for jobs that before you would never have had the confidence to apply for, because now you've had this reinforcement through these interactions. So this is an example of how malleable or how flexible or how, again, self-determining people can be in deciding to put themselves in situations that at first may seem intimidating, may seem very may seem impossible, but are after all surmountable. So I think that neither of those other views take that into account. So that's very important, this concept of agency in terms of symbolic interaction. And now moving a little bit more into marketing. So in the chapter one, it's a short chapter, you can read about the 3M Corporation, how marketing happens within that company, the idea of needs and wants. I think there's a question like that on the quiz. Understand the difference, and it's important for marketing, right? Because needs have to do with things like the need for food, clothing, shelter. So we have a need as individuals. We'll be cold if we go outside naked. So we have a need to cover ourselves. We have a need to drink water, to eat food, because otherwise we'll die or we'll be dehydrated. We have a need for shelter to protect ourselves from the elements, from snow, from rain. So these are just needs. These are basic to human beings, and to some extent animals have these needs as well. So the difference is that, and this is what is interesting in a consumer society. So in a traditional society, yes, we need to cover the body, and then in a traditional society there are certain kinds of clothing that are acceptable for women and for men, right? That are determined by that society. And so women have a particular kind of clothing, men have a particular kind of clothing. Depending on your status, you might be dressed a certain way. But depending on your age, you may have to wear certain kinds of clothing or not. If, for example, if we look, back hundreds of years ago, right? People that were aristocrats, people that had social stature, were allowed to wear certain types of clothing. Other people were not, were forbidden from wearing those kinds of clothing. So there was this period in history where things were determined according to social structure and social class of a society. There were sumptuary laws that governed what people could wear. So that's today in a consumer society, we have choices. We have a freedom to decide. It's not that if you're in this position, you can only wear this type of clothing, or we have certain norms, of course, about male and female clothing, and maybe certain norms, much less so than years ago, but about what is appropriate for people of different ages. So we do have those kinds of norms. But generally, people have a very vast kind of freedom to decide within these ranges of acceptability. And so marketing, or in a consumer society, marketing becomes important because people do have all these choices and people are individually making these kinds of choices. So, for example, we need to wear clothing. We're no longer restricted by our societies, unless we are in a traditional community. That's a possibility. Then we may have to adhere to certain regulations of that community. But let's say now I'm speaking about the average or mainstream American that really doesn't have that traditional kind of lifestyle any longer. So in that case, the individual is marketed to by all these different companies. And so some people feel they want, so this is the difference between a need and a want. So we need to cover ourselves, but we want to be covered in Prada or Chanel or Old Navy or Gap, as the case may be. So what happens in a consumer society is that all of the different brands are trying to promote and trying to create a sense of identification so that they want people to feel that they need to have these luxury products, or that they need to, if we go into another direction now, you need to live in a certain address, at a certain address, a certain location, right? Because that's prestigious, right? So living on Fifth Avenue or living on Park Avenue for people in a certain socioeconomic class becomes very important, because they can't live on Lexington Avenue, because that's not, doesn't give you as high a status. Or you need to have the address because you're going to be interacting with people at a very high level, and so you need to have the correct address, right? So people have these feelings, but in reality, all we need is just a covering over our heads, a place that, to protect us from the elements. But in a consumer society, there is that idea that I need to have a certain kind of furniture in my house. I need to have a certain type of address. I need to have only this kind of watch from this type of brand. Or I need to take these kinds of vacations and not others. So what marketing tries to do is to convince people that their needs are really, or their wants are really needs. So that's something interesting to think about. In terms of the exam, there might be a question that be like 3 questions or so, understanding fundamentally what symbolic interaction is. There might be just one question about the connection between symbolic interaction and marketing. So if you just understand it generally, there'll be a question on the pricing, on the 4Ps, and then a question on the different phases of marketing and consumer society from according to the textbook. So just read chapter 1 and you'll be prepared for the quiz. You'll have 30 minutes to do your quiz. Once you be in it, it'll be posted up on Monday very early in the morning at 6 a.m. until Friday at midnight. But once you start it, you have 30 minutes to complete the 10 multiple choice questions with 4 choices for each question. So thank you for listening, and the next week there'll be another video, perhaps shorter than this one, just giving you an overview. Take a look at the lecture notes up on Blackboard, and good luck with everything this week. Take care.